There are 7.8 billion people living in a world in the grips of the pandemic, and vaccines for only 650 million of them. Produced and distributed by only a handful of large pharmaceutical companies, and so far distributed mostly to rich countries of the world. To change that, countries like India and South Africa are urging the World Trade Organization to introduce a temporary patent waiver for producing COVID-19 vaccines. The idea is to allow other countries to make their own versions of vaccines and scale up production, something they say is essential to win the race against time with a mutating virus, but so far without success. The UK, US, and the EU are among those blocking the waiver, and major pharma companies are opposing it too. So why won't they budge? Are we prolonging the pandemic because pharma companies want the big bucks, or is it more complicated? 5 major COVID-19 vaccine producers account for over 90% of all vaccines produced globally. It's projected companies will scale up massively by the end of 2021. But proponents of the waiver say production needs to happen faster, especially in light of boosters or new vaccines we may need to tackle a mutating virus.
You know, patents were never supposed to be implemented during emergencies like a pandemic. It says so explicitly even in the TRIPS agreement. The purpose of this waiver is to make sure that countries everywhere can increase production and generate enough supply to meet the demand that is increasing so rapidly.
Over 100 nations led by India and South Africa are asking the WTO for a temporary suspension of certain patent rules enshrined in the so-called TRIPS agreement, short for trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. To put it simply, supporters say a patent waiver would help overcome certain legal barriers, preventing them from producing their own vaccines. They also argue the waiver could be a first step towards distributing vaccines more equally. For now, over 80% of all vaccines have gone into the arms of people in rich and middle-income countries. And NGOs estimate that 9 in 10 people in 70 countries won't receive a jab this year. In fact, many predict that most poor countries will not achieve mass vaccination until 2024. Supporters of the waiver also argue more manufacturers in more countries could drive prices down. AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson have vowed to provide vaccines on a non-profit basis during the pandemic, but Moderna and Pfizer have not. Pfizer is charging $39 in the US and around $37 in the EU for 2 jabs. Prices that are set to rise even further in 2022 and which are essentially unpayable for poorer countries.
Nobody's saying that they shouldn't make any profits from the pandemic. And in fact, the companies are making lots of money. These will be like among the biggest selling products in the world for anything. These are massive amounts of money. If you open up the licensing so that more people can use the intellectual property, it doesn't mean that you don't get anything. It just means that you just don't have a monopoly. The monopoly is inappropriate in a pandemic.
One government that signaled it may rethink its opposition to the waiver is the Biden administration. Outside pressure on the US has been mounting. Over 170 former heads of state and Nobel laureates, as well as a series of US lawmakers and global organizations, have called on the US government to reverse its veto.
It's the rich country governments that have been opposing the TRIPS waiver in the WTO. If the US administration and President Biden agree to stop opposing it, that's a huge step forward, and I do believe it would persuade a number of other countries to stop opposing the waiver.
But opposition to the idea of a waiver remains strong. The EU, UK, Japan, and Brazil are among those blocking it. The pharma and intellectual property lobby are opposed to it too, and some say a waiver is unnecessary.
There's been absolutely no credible evidence that intellectual property rights have constituted a barrier to development of the needed COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics.
Opponents to the proposal say that waiving intellectual property rights could kill innovation, and that if innovation is not rewarded, it could discourage investors and companies from spending money on such research in the future. For them, voluntary licenses are the way to go, and they say that they've already been granted to manufacturers fulfilling requirements. Many also say the waiver wouldn't lead to more vaccine doses. One of the arguments, the world is already working at maximum speed.
The manufacturing capacity that the world can put to this problem is being fully utilized now. The central challenge is manufacturing at scale, and it just takes time. It takes 60 to 110 days to produce a single batch of COVID COVID-19 vaccines.
Countries like Bangladesh and Canada, on the other hand, have claimed they do have production capacity. It's just not being used. All sides agree that a patent waiver would not be a silver bullet. The production and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines involves many challenges, from the complexity of supply chains to shortages of raw materials and the need to meet high production standards. A central issue, the backers of the waiver say, therefore, is for companies to share their know-how and for governments to increase pressure on them to do so.
The waiver is one part of a broader package that we definitely have to have. But we must have the transfer of technology, and we must have global efforts to increase the supply of essential raw materials to make these drugs and vaccines.
The WHO has already created a COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or CTAP, designed to do just that: share vaccine technology, skills, and know-how, with prominent supporters like US Chief Medical Advisor Anthony Fauci.
Say yes, yes, yes.
So far, none of the major pharmaceutical companies producing vaccines have signed up.